Hi guys, welcome back. We're going to be discussing the question for on June 2022, paper 21. The question says Australia's foreign exchange rate fluctuates, which is sort of telling us that it's a floating exchange rate system, and that is why it has been fluctuating. Or possibly it could also be a managed floating system where the government intervenes. But anyways, the value of Australia's exports is regularly greater than the value of its imports, which is a good sign. It's indicating that Australia has a healthy balance of payment. So basically, it's telling us that the government of the country increased the income taxes to basically sort of reduce the inflation rate. Now, income tax is basically government's fiscal policy, right? And if you increase the income tax, then obviously it does have an impact on inflation rate because it affects the demand in the economy, the aggregate demand in the economy. And we'll just come to that. How will it happen? So definitely then if the government is trying to reduce the inflation rate, it has to be a deflationary policy, a deflationary fiscal policy, right? It also used other policy measures to increase its economic growth rate. So on one hand, it was trying to reduce inflation rate, but on the other hand, it was also trying to increase its economic growth rate. The reason why it's using other policy measures to increase economic growth rate is because what's going to happen is that because of the deflationary fiscal policy, because when you will increase the income tax, your aggregate demand will go down, and that will also reduce your economic growth. So the government has to sort of, come up to offset that negative impact of reduction in economic growth. The government is coming up with other policy measures to actually increase economic growth because deflationary fiscal policy would reduce economic growth, and the government does not want that, right? Although it will help the government achieving a reduction in inflation rate, but it will also reduce the economic growth, which is the downside of a deflationary fiscal policy. So the government is also coming up with alternate measures to increase economic growth rate at the same time using other policies, right? The first question part A says define foreign exchange rate. Remember that a definition should not exceed more than two lines. What is foreign exchange rate? It's the rate at which one currency is exchanged with the other currency, and that is it. That's it. There are three type of exchange rate systems. You don't need to tell that. You just need to write that it's the value of a currency that is being, exchanged with the other currency, right? So the value of a currency at which one currency is exchanged with the other currency, and that is it. Part B says, so for example, just to let you know, a dollar, let's suppose, is worth 300 rupees. So that's the exchange rate of a dollar to rupees. Like if you sell $1 to buy rupees, then you will be able to buy 300 rupees. If you sell 300 rupees, you'll be able to buy a dollar. So it's telling us what is the value of a dollar in terms of rupees. So the value of $1 in terms of rupees is 300, and the value of 300 rupees is equal to $1. So it's just telling us the value of a currency in terms of the other currency. Explain two reasons why the value of a country's exports may be greater than the value of its imports. Now, this is a very good question. It's simply telling us that because in the case study, in the paragraph, first of all, this is not a case study, it's just an opening paragraph they give. But usually you don't necessarily have to link these answers with this. It's not really required. If you want to do that, you can do that, but that is not the objective in section B essay questions. However, that is the objective in section A questions. So it says explain two reasons why the value of a country's exports may be greater than the value of its imports. Now, for a question like this, I am going to be not only giving you two reasons, I'll be giving you more than two reasons. For a 4-marker, you don't need to sort of explain what export means, neither you need to explain what import means. However, you guys know what export and import means. Export refers to foreign demand for domestic goods, while imports refer to domestic demand for foreign goods. But you don't need to sort of explain that for a 4-marker. You just directly jump to the main question. You say that the reason why the value of a country's exports may be greater than the value of the imports. You also don't need to link it by saying that, like in the paragraph above, the Australian exports are more than their imports, hence whatever. But you don't need to link that. So yeah, it's not required. So the reason why a country's exports may be greater than its imports is because obviously the country's exports may be, number one, sort of competitive. And being competitive means that it can produce it at a low average cost. And, because they are competitive, the average cost of production, that is the cost per unit of an export, goes down. And that makes it competitive, reducing the price of exports. So the P of X stands for the price of exports goes down, making the exports more competitive relative to other countries. So make sure that you write the word relative to other countries. So the reason is that since exports are more competitive relative to other countries, that makes exports competitive. And the price of exports goes down while the quantity demanded for exports go up. And because of that, the export revenues go up, and that causes the value of a country's exports to go up as well. So, so first of all, exports are competitive, because their average cost of production is going down. That average cost of production stands for unit cost of production. So the unit cost of production is going down, its cost per unit of output is going down. And that could be because of skilled labor, that could be because of a rise in productivity in the economy. I mean, the productivity of the export industry might be going up. There might be more skilled labor in the economy. There might be more capital intensive methods of production that will definitely result in higher productivity. And that would also result in higher efficiency as well of the business, and that would result in the average cost to go down. Or there could be higher economies of scale in the economy that the export sector is experiencing, or maybe the economy is experiencing as well, and that obviously the export sector is also taking advantage of it. So that would bring the unit cost of production or the average cost to go down, and because of that, the exports would get competitive. Quite simple, right? Or the exports could also get competitive, maybe because the quality of the exports is going up because of better quality raw material, maybe more skilled labor, etc. So yes, these are all the reasons why your exports will get competitive and why the average cost may go down, right? Or more because of more specialization and division of labor. All these factors could sort of contribute. Um, so moving forward, so these are the factors that would make the exports competitive. Moving forward, you could also talk about the fact that the value of so the first of all, the question is saying that why the value of a country's exports may be greater than the value of its imports. Now, so you need to also focus on the fact that exports are not only growing, but they are telling us to compare the exports as in comparison with imports. So for that, yes, you say that yes, the exports are going up for this and this and this reason that you have mentioned over here. However, there's another thing, that the currency or the exchange rate might play something, might have a role to play over here as well. Because what if the currency gets weaker? What if the currency gets weaker? We know that if the currency gets weaker, maybe because it depreciates, either it could depreciate or maybe the government intervenes and it devalues the currency. In either case, whenever the currency gets weaker, we know what happens is that the price of exports go down while the price of imports go up. And why is that? Because when the currency depreciates, what happens is that exports become relatively cheaper while imports become expensive. So for example, let's say if a dollar is worth 100 rupees and now a dollar, let's say a rupee depreciates, right? So if the rupee depreciates, it would depreciate to, let's say, maybe 250 rupees a dollar. Now rupees has gotten weaker. And because of that, what happens is that Pakistani exports to the US would be more competitive, artificially competitive, although they are not competitive in real terms, as in Pakistan is not producing them at a lower cost, but there's just an artificial advantage over here because of the currency exchange rate depreciating, because Pakistan's rupee is getting weaker against the dollar. So now against $1, US could buy 250 worth of Pakistani goods. So obviously the price of exports for the US will go down and they'll import more from us. If they import more from us, so our exports will go up. So the quantity demanded for exports will go up and the export revenues would go up for Pakistan, right? And on the other hand, the imports would go down because now it would take us 250 rupees to buy $1 worth of goods, while initially it was only 100. So the quantity demanded for imports would go down and our import expenditures would go down. And that is one reason why the balance of trade in Pakistan could actually improve, because, the price of exports are going down while the price of imports, Pakistani imports, are going up. And that could be because of currency becoming weaker. So instead of just writing that the currency depreciates or devalues, first talk about the fact that, the rupee is weak against the dollar. So if the currency is weak, it's weak. Obviously, a weaker currency would mean that remember that a weaker currency, just write it down, that a weaker currency would always make your exports artificially competitive because the price of exports will go down. On the other hand, a weaker currency would make your imports expensive and the price of imports would go up. Okay. So that's another reason why the value of your exports might exceed the value of your imports. So these are the two reasons. These two reasons are good reasons that you could give. Currency depreciation being the second factor, the third factor being currency depreciation being the third factor, the fourth factor, the second factor. The third factor that could be is, remember when we were studying aggregate demand, I made you guys, learn about how exports could go up. So that's the same concept that is being applied here. If you open up your notes, you look at you look at those answers, what sort of causes your exports to go up. It's all these points that are tested in the past paper right now are actually down in your register. You guys have written it down in your register actually. So the third reason why exports could be more than imports is that incomes abroad may have gone up, right? So incomes abroad are increasing. So if incomes abroad are increasing, they will obviously our major trading partners, our major trading partners would actually import more from us, and as a result our exports will go up. Definitely our exports will go up. You need to understand that the value of a current country's exports means export revenues. You need to understand that, and the value of its imports means import expenditures. First of all, you need to understand this, okay? So if incomes abroad are increasing, maybe because there's a boom in our major trading partners, or there's more economic growth over there, maybe the employment levels are rising and industries are flourishing over there, and there's more economic growth, industries are making a lot of profits. So definitely they will import more from us, right? They could import more capital goods from us, more consumer goods from us, but in either case, our exports will go up because of incomes rising abroad or amongst our major trading partners. Also, maybe you could also say that because the question says that why is the value of exports more than the value of imports. So let's say if the export revenue, so if I talk about export revenue versus import expenditure, so let's say if our export revenue was $100 versus the import expenditure was initially it was maybe somewhere around around $90. So, what if our import expenditure is going down? Let's say instead of export expenditure going up, what if our import expenditure is going down? So import expenditure goes down and it becomes $70, while the export revenue stays the same at $100. And this would also still make export revenues more than import expenditures. So instead of export revenues going up, export revenues are the same while import expenditures are going down, and that still makes export revenues more than import expenditures. So you should also take into account this factor as well. And import expenditures could go down maybe because incomes at home are going down, maybe because incomes at home are falling, right? So if incomes at home go down, in incomes at home go down, maybe because there's a recession in our country, and there's a recession in our country, then aggregate demand in our country would be falling, and economic growth in our country would be falling because our unemployment will be rising and national income would be falling as well. So obviously when we know when your incomes go down, when Y goes down, our imports go down as well. So we import less because we save more and we consume less. We spend less on luxuries and wants, so the overall import expenditures go down. So this is another reason why imports could go down as well, right? Because of a recession, or maybe because the domestic goods become more competitive. So maybe the domestic goods become sort of more competitive, and the domestic goods become more competitive. What happens is that people switch their expenditures to more domestic goods instead of buying more imported goods. They switch their expenditures to buying more domestic goods, right? And that causes a significant reduction in our import bill, and our import expenditures go down, and that again increases the value of a country's exports over a country's imports. So, or maybe you could also say that our domestic goods are becoming more competitive because maybe the government is subsidizing the domestic industry. Maybe the government is subsidizing our infant industry. The infant industry consists of all those small firms who are, who've just started up, who are in their infant stage, who are either, who have just started up, or, who are in their growing phase, and they have a huge potential competitive advantage and a good future that lies ahead of them. And they need to be protected, because if they aren't protected, then they'll definitely lose out, and the industry would shut down. So the infant industry of an economy comprises of all those firms that are small right now, that are in their growing phases, and they have a potential advantage, a competitive advantage, and a good future that lies ahead of them, on the condition that they are being protected by the government or by the state. Therefore, it is important that the state or the policymakers of an economy always come up with policies to protect their domestic industries. And one way they could do that is by subsidizing the domestic firms, subsidizing the infant industry to become, and because this would actually help, subsidizing it would actually make them more competitive, because they could use the subsidy money, they could actually use the subsidy money to invest in research and development and innovation, and come up with cost effective measures to reduce the cost of production and reduce the unit cost and the average cost, that is per unit cost, and make their domestic goods more competitive. And what that would do is, the effect of that would be that the consumer would actually switch, or it will shift their expenditures from imports to buying more domestic goods, and that would again reduce the import expenditures and improving the balance of trade. So you could talk about this, or maybe the import expenditures are going down because of maybe the government has imposed tariffs, right? Maybe the government has imposed tariffs or import restrictions, or import restrictions such as tariffs and quotas, or maybe trade barriers. Trade barriers are like import restrictions. So because of these trade barriers or import restrictions that the government might has sort of implemented, the imports have become expensive and they are going down, and so does the import expenditures go down. You need to look at the question. The question is not only asking you about what is causing the value of a country's exports to rise. 95% of the students, they missed out this point, that they're not only talking about the exports, they're also talking about the value of its imports. They need to know why the value of your imports is going to, because they're saying, why is the value of exports more than the value of its imports? If you're saying that probably exports are more competitive, or the currency is depreciated, or the currency is weak, that's okay, that's good. But why? But maybe the imports are going down, and that again makes exports more than imports. Maybe nothing had happened to exports, maybe it's all imports that went down, and that again made the difference of exports versus imports broader, right? So you have to attempt the papers with an open mind if you want that A star or a distinction. Moving forward, part C says, analyze how an increase in income tax can affect a country's inflation rate. So for a question like this, whenever they talk about affecting, so affecting could be increasing the inflation rate as well and reducing it as well. So you need to sort of talk about both the ways in which a country's inflation rate could be affected. How could it actually go up, how could it go down? So for a question like this, how would you start an answer? You would start an answer again directly by saying, if the government income taxes have an impact on a country's inflation rate, in the following ways, right? You don't need to sort of give an introduction where you define. So there's no need to even define inflation rate here. You could start off the answer by saying a rise in income tax could impact the inflation rate in two ways. It could also make the inflation rate go up, or it could make the inflation rate go down. Inflation is, yes, if you want to sort of define inflation, you could say in the second line that inflation is a rise in the general price level and is one of the major concerns for policymakers, because it's a very important macroeconomic indicator that speaks a lot about the economic health of a nation. And then moving forward, you could say that if income taxes rise, because over here you need to analyze, right? You need to develop that chain of analysis. So you could say that, if income taxes go up, how would that affect the inflation rate? So how would it affect the inflation rate is, what's going to happen is that if the income tax rate goes up, so if income tax is basically a direct tax, if the income tax goes up, what's going to happen is that first of all, disposable income will go down. And if disposable income will go down, what's going to happen is that the purchasing power would go down, definitely. And if the purchasing power would go down, it will definitely mean that consumers will spend less now, because the power to purchase has gone down, so consumer spending would go down. So you need to create a change. Just don't write increasing income taxes will reduce inflation, because consumer spending goes down. But why does consumer spending goes down? There has to be a link before that. You say that disposable income goes down, and then you say purchasing power goes down. That causes consumer spending to go down. A fall in consumer spending would reduce the C component of the aggregate demand equation, because aggregate demand is the total spending in the economy that also consists of consumer spending. So if consumer spending goes down, aggregate demand goes down, spending in the economy goes down, and what's going to happen is that your aggregate demand will reduce. That will have a dampening effect on prices. It will have a dampening effect, or a reduction. It was basically going to cause a downfall or a reduction in demand for inflation. So demand for inflationary pressures would go down. And then you'll say that this concept is illustrated in the below diagram. And then you'll make a diagram where you'll say that, this is AD, this is AS. And then you'll say that if aggregate demand goes down from 81 to 82, we can clearly see that the price level goes down from P1 to P2, right? That's it. You write real GDP here, and then you write price level here. That's it. So you say the price level goes down from P1 to P2, causing a depressing effect on the demand for inflation, causing a reduction in the demand for inflationary pressures, causing the price level to go down. Okay, that's it. That's half the answer is done here. Okay. Then you could also say, so apart from demand, so now majority of the students are able to answer the fact that demand for inflation goes down. So remember, guys, I'm going to teach you a trick today. Whenever they give you a factor, such as it could be income tax or whatever, it could be income tax, it could be interest rates, it could be income tax, it could be interest rates, it could be government spending, it could be any policy, because government spending, interest rates, in interest rates and income taxes, these are all policy tools of the government. Government sort of increases, decreases interest rates, increases, decreases income tax and government spending to actually achieve its macroeconomic objectives. And one of the objectives it tries to achieve is to reduce inflation. So whenever it's trying to reduce inflation, always talk about both the types of inflation. Think about demand pull inflation as well and cost push inflation as well, right? You need to think about demand pull and cost push inflation. So don't just think about demand pull inflation. There has to be a link, because when they're talking about inflation, there has to be a link to both types of inflation. And yes, apart from just demand pull inflation, there is a link with cost push inflation as well. Because what's going to happen is that when income taxes would go up, because you need to understand that consumers are workers in the evening and they're workers in the morning and they're consumers by the evening. So if income taxes are going up, the workers would feel that their disposable incomes are going down. So we are seeing that these workers will spend less now because consumer spending would go down. But then if their disposable incomes are going down, maybe the trade union will put pressure on the firms to actually increase the wages now, right? Because their disposable incomes are going down now, so maybe there might be a pressure from trade unions to push up the wages. So not all workers, but probably some of the workers who have a high socioeconomic status and who have significant bargaining power in the economy will be able to press wages upwards, will be able to push wages upwards in their favor. And a rise in wages, remember, a rise in wages without a rise in productivity, a rise in wages without a rise in productivity, I mean, what I'm saying is that if wages are going up, then productivity should go up as well. And if wages are going up and productivity is not going up for the businesses, productivity means efficiency. And if efficiency of the labor is not going up, but the business is paying them more. So, for example, if I am paying my worker more money than before, but he's not able to perform better than before, then my costs will rise. But if I'm paying him more and he's able to perform better than before, and he's helping me make more profits, then I won't say that paying him more has led to a rise in my cost, because he's also contributing more to profits and output now. So my cost has not gone up. Although I am paying more, but my cost has not gone up because he's also leading to ultimately leading to more profits for me now. So, but if the wages are going up without a rise in productivity, it would cause a rise in the cost of production, which will result into cost push inflationary pressures in the economy. So yes, you could say that on one hand, what's going to happen is your demand pull inflation would go down, but on the other hand, cost push inflation would go up. At least some cost push inflation would go up. The majority, more of the effect would be on the demand side, because yes, immediately there would be a negative demand shock and AD would shift inwards, and then demand pull inflation would go down. But then there would also be an effect on the cost side as well, because yes, in the long run, ultimately, workers would start pushing for higher wages, and then the cost will rise, and then cost push inflation will happen, right? Um, so since the question was saying how will it affect, and like I said, affect, when the question says affect, what comes under effect? Increase and decrease both comes under effect. Now this is where the students make the most or the biggest mistake, that they only consider one factor into account. So they'll be like, okay, it's effect, then probably we need to talk about maybe decrease or increase. No, you have to talk about both things. Even when they're talking about inflation, you need to think about from both perspectives. What will happen to demand pull inflation? Okay, fine, I got the answer for demand pull inflation, but is demand pull inflation the only inflation? Is there an element to cost side as well? I need to think about that as well. So think about the fact that how could it impact cost push inflation as well. There's another factor, the third factor that could happen is that a rise in income taxes, because it's a 6-mark question, right? A rise in income taxes, so 2 marks you could say for each point. A rise in income taxes would result in higher tax revenues for the government. Higher tax revenues for the government means that government spending would go up on the economy. If government spends more money on subsidies, so cost of production would go down, and this would reduce this would reduce cost push inflationary pressures. Cost push inflation would go down. Also, if the government spending goes up in the form of, let's say, infrastructure in the economy, pardon my writing, if the government spending goes up in the form of education in the economy, healthcare in the economy, this would result in an outward shift in LRAS, while this would cause an outward shift in SRAS. So whether SRAS shifts outwards or whether LRAS shifts outwards, in both cases, cost push inflation will go down, right? This would result into an outward shift of the SRAS would result into, short-term cost push inflationary pressures going down, while a shift in LRAS would cause the country's productive capacity to go up. At the same time, it would also result into long-term cost push inflationary pressures to go down. So you see yourself, I mean, these are valid points and there's so much to think about it. So it's just, the more you start thinking, the more you extend your scope for economics, the better you will get and the better answers you'll write in the exam. Okay, so parties here discuss whether or not government should aim for high economic growth. For a question like this, I would say yes, do give a nice introduction as well. Although introductions at O levels are specifically not required. Not required means they won't deduct marks on it if you don't write the introduction. But again, writing a nice starting to your essay always has an impact on the examiner. So if I were you, I would have said that, economic growth is one of the major economic objectives that the government tries to achieve, because economic growth acts as a measure of living standard as well, and it helps the government. Measuring economic growth helps the government compare the living standards between countries, because when you're measuring economic growth, you're actually measuring the GDP of a country, right? So it helps the government actually compare the living standard between countries, right? And whatever the rate of economic growth for a country would be, it would have an impact on other macroeconomic indicators as well, such as inflation, unemployment, employment, BOP. And that is why knowing the growth of an economy, the rate of growth of an economy, is so important for the government, and it has major implications for policymakers. Why does it has major implications for policymakers? Because if the rate of economic growth is going down, then policymakers need to come up with policies, maybe demand side policies, maybe supply side policies to improve the rate of economic growth, right? So I would suggest that write it like this. These sort of wordings would definitely make you guys stand out from the rest, right? Because you need to sort of differentiate your essay from others, and you need to tell the examiner from your performance that you are better than all the rest of the candidates in the exam. So you could start your answer by whatever I've just said. Probably not everything what I've said, but probably, extracting a few lines from what I just said, and then define economic growth as, economic growth refers to an increase in real GDP in the economy, right? Now, then after a nice introduction and a definition of economic growth, you'll transition your essay to the second paragraph and you'll say, um, government should definitely aim for a high economic growth because it has various potential benefits for an economy. So you'll say that yes, definitely government should aim for a high economic growth because it has various potential benefits for an economy. Not only for the economy, it has various welfare benefits attached to it in terms of living standards and economic development. So a higher economic growth would also lead to higher economic development and better living standards in the economy. And what you write is that a higher economic growth also has various positive implications or positive consequences for other macroeconomic indicators, such as current account, BOP, employment, inflation in the economy, living standards in the economy. So this is how you start your answer, and then you transition your answer towards why is economic growth really, why are governments aiming for a high rate of economic growth, and why is economic growth so important economic indicator for the state, right? For the policymakers. Because we know that a high rate of economic growth would definitely result into higher incomes and employment. Because when economic growth goes up, employment goes up and your incomes go up. We know that your real GDP goes up as well. And then you'll say this is shown in the below diagram, and you say that economic growth could occur when aggregate demand shifts outwards. We know, which is actual growth, right? We know that when AD goes out from 81 to 82, this results into a rise in real GDP from Y1 to Y2. Although at the same time, there is a bit of inflation, but a bit of inflation, a bit is only okay. A bit can be, a bit can be, we can compromise on a bit of inflation if the economic growth is high. So if we are having a high rate of economic growth and at the same time we have some demand for inflationary pressure, so the economy would not be really concerned about it, and the economy would be okay with it. It would accept it. It would make that compromise. It would make that trade-off. So you see, I've just um, explained it in 3-4 different ways. So because the economic growth is high, right? However, yes, it would be inflationary, but demand for inflation would be a concern when the rate of demand for inflation is high. But right now, we are assuming that it's not high, right? Because we are making this assumption. And if aggregate demand goes up, maybe because your C is going up, maybe because your I is going up, maybe because exports are going up, maybe because your government spending is going up. So that's really good because you talk about the fact that economic growth, because of a rise in consumer expenditure, would mean that people are spending more in the economy, which would cause them to satisfy their needs and wants, causing a rise in living standards. You talk about the fact that if AD is going up because of a rise in investments, then investment in capital goods would result into firms expanding themselves and would result into employment levels going up. It would result into firms making more profits. And if firms are making more profits, then they'll re-expand themselves, invest in research and development, which would also have an effect on a country's productive capacity in the long run. The PPC would shift outward in the long run as well. Your LRAS would shift outward in the long run as well, increasing the country's productive potential and productive capacity. It would also result into a rise in employment levels as well, because when firms expand, they would hire more workers. Probably they might invest in research and development and innovation. What if the AD is, because of a rise in exports, resulting into a surplus on the current account, or maybe a reduction in the deficit on the current account, causing your foreign exchange reserves to go up and the balance of trade to be positive because your exports are going up. And maybe if AD is going up because of a rise in government spending, maybe the government is spending more money on merit goods, on essential public services like healthcare, school education. So that will definitely boost AD because it would cause employment to increase. And employment, if the employment goes up, the income goes up. If incomes go up, the consumption goes up. So yes, consumption is a part of AD. Then again, your AD goes up. And then what happens is that, again, government spending, especially on infrastructure, education, and healthcare, has an impact of increasing the productive capacity of the economy, right? Uh, so, this growth is known as actual growth. And what is going to happen is that, uh, unemployment would definitely go down. That is so essential. And that is exactly why, don't just say that this will happen, this will happen, this will happen, this will happen, this will happen. Okay, this incomes will go up, tax revenue will go up, unemployment will go down. I mean, related with the fact that you're saying that is why the fact that unemployment goes down is one of the reasons why the government is actually aiming for economic growth, because the question is saying that why are governments aiming for a high rate of economic growth? So they're aiming for a high rate of economic growth because of the fact that a high rate of economic growth is accompanied with a very low rate of inflation, and inflation is another pressing issue for the economy, for the policymakers, and that is why they need to aim for high rates of economic growth, so that unemployment goes down in the economy, because unemployment is a pressing issue. Because the higher the unemployment, the more would be the pressure on the government's limited tax revenue to be spent on allowances and unemployment benefits, right? Which has a significant opportunity cost because that money could be spent elsewhere as well. And economic growth would also result into a rise in living standards as well in the economy. I mean, economic growth also result into a rise in tax revenues as well. Because when firms are expanding and the firms are making more profits because incomes are growing, then definitely revenues from income taxes would go up, since consumer spending is going up. So tax revenue from income taxes would go up. Tax revenue from sales tax would go up. Since consumption is rising, tax revenue from corporate taxes would go up since profits of the firms are rising, right? Also maybe because when incomes go up, maybe consumers might import as well. So tax revenues from tariffs would go up as well. Now, the fact that they're importing, that's not really a good thing, but that's not entirely a bad thing either. Maybe the economy is importing more capital goods. Although it's causing a deficit on the current account, but at the same time, importing capital goods is important for a developing economy as well. So we can argue in the evaluation part of that. But again, right now, what we are seeing is that revenue from tariffs is going up as well. So this revenue would mean that a rise in revenue would result into a fall in budget deficit, right? If budget deficits go down, also the government could use this tax money to probably, if the tax money results into a huge amount of if, probably it could use that to pay off its loans to the IMF or World Bank. It could use that to reduce its debt. So that is why the governments aim for a high economic growth. And the reason they aim for a high rate of economic growth is what you write is that it has a lot of potential advantages on various economic indicators that the government is already trying to achieve. Right. And at the same time, let's say if the government, because of economic growth, what if the economic growth is due to a rise in government spending on, let's say, education, on, let's say, healthcare, on infrastructure? Because all these factors would result into your AD to go up in the short term. In the subsequent effect, remember I told you what the subsequent effect is in the long term effect is. So the immediate effect or the subsequent effect would be that AD would go up because the government starts spending money on education, healthcare infrastructure, and that causes a rise in employment, which causes a rise in consumption, and the incomes go up and the AD goes up. And then that's the cycle of the process. And what happens is, but that's the immediate effect. But the long-term effect is that your LRAS would go up. And when your LRAS goes up, we know that if this is the long-run aggregate supply curve and this is the AD, and if LRAS rises to, let's say, from LRAS1 to LRAS2, that causes your real GDP to go up from YFE to YFE means full employment level of national income. So the full employment level of national income even goes up from YFE1 to YFE2, indicating a rise in productive capacity. You could also draw an outward shift in PPC to represent that as well. Label the PPC as capital goods and consumer goods, since this is a macroeconomic PPC. But the good part about a shift in outward shift in LRAS is that it results into long-term reduction in cost push inflationary pressures. And that is why the government is actually aiming for economic growth. Maybe the government is aiming for long-term economic growth because of the fact that it knows that it would result in long-term reduction in cost of production in the economy, reducing the cost push inflationary impacts. And reducing the cost push inflation is so important for us because we know that, it has an impact on our exports, because our exports would get more competitive if cost push inflation goes down, and the cost of living would go down as well. So yes, that is why the government aims for high rate of economic growth, and it should aim for a high rate of economic growth because of the potential benefits. However, what you will say is that not all economic growth would result into beneficial outcomes, because it depends upon how this rate of economic growth, at what rate has the economic growth been achieved. Maybe the government, maybe the rate of economic growth is excessively high, which is causing unsustainable pressure on the existing factors of production. And if that's happening, what's going to happen is that it would result into significant demand for inflationary pressures. If economic growth is at the expense, although yes, there's economic growth, we're not saying that there's no economic growth. What we are saying is that economic growth is at the expense of significant increase in AD, and the AD is actually increasing beyond the full employment level of output. So what you're going to do is that you'll make an LRAS curve, and you'll say that, this is your long-run aggregate supply, and this was your AD1, and from AD1 you move to AD2. And what happened is that your real GDP went up from Y1, and your real GDP reached to the full employment level of output. And at this point, you've actually exhausted your capacity, according to what Keynes said. And beyond a rise in AD2, what's going to happen is that beyond AD2, although yes, you have inflation in the economy, so some inflation in the economy, but beyond a rise of aggregate demand beyond AD2, what's the only thing that's going to happen is that it's going to make matters worse for the economy, because first of all, your real GDP will not go up. Your real GDP is not going up. In fact, your price level went significantly up from P2 to P3, and that is not good for the economy. That's really unhealthy for the economy, because this is just explaining a situation where you are just having inflation without any economic growth. So there's no economic growth, but yes, there's demand for inflation because of the unsustainable pressure you're putting on your existing factors of production, because the existing factors of production cannot respond now anymore. This is a situation, this is known as overheating. You have overheated your FOPs. And that is only causing demand for inflation without any rise in real GDP. So when you're saying that should governments aim for high economic growth, yes, they should aim for high economic growth, but that economic growth should be sustainable. Sustainable economic growth means that economic growth without significant inflationary pressures. Because then that economic growth is not good for the economy, it's not healthy for the economy. Because we can see from the diagram. So this is how you need to write your answer. Also, it depends upon the rate of, like I said, economic growth at the expense of depletion of the environment. Maybe you are just depleting all your non-renewable resources, because if you deplete your non-renewable resources, it might result into it might result in less growth for the future population in future. Maybe let's say in 2050, you might not have the resources to maintain the same level of growth you had in your 2020s, right? Economic growth at the expense of significant inflationary pressures is not healthy for the economy. It's not good for the economy because it's just resulting into demand for inflation, and your population is suffering from high cost of living without any real, without any increase in real GDP at all. That's what the diagram is suggesting, right? So if you're saying that should governments aim for high economic growth, yes, they should aim, but then they should also come up with ways in order to not cause, they should also look into the fact that economic growth should not be at the expense of significant demand for inflation, because then a high rate of economic growth is not actually worth it for the economy. It's not going to make the people or the welfare of the people better off. It's not desirable for the economy, because two things are happening here. Firstly, your real GDP is not going up. Secondly, your demand for inflation is going up at extreme levels, at significantly high rates. And that's a problem. That's a concern, because your population is suffering like that. So the policymakers need to come up with ways in which they could control the rate at which maybe the economy is AD is going up, because a significant increase in AD could just cause significant demand for inflation, and a point where the economy's full employment has reached, then AD should not go up beyond that level. Also remember the fact that if at times we've already studied that economic growth could also result into depletion of non-renewable resources, and if your resources get depleted, then your future population will suffer because they will not have the resources to produce output for themselves. So maybe let's say this is 2023 right now, but what would happen? Would the country have the resources to produce the output and satisfy the consumers' demands and the population's demands and needs and wants in 2050s and 2060s, just like the way it is doing it right now? Do we have those resources? Are we conserving resources for the future population, or are we overutilizing them? Because ultimately, overutilization of these resources would deplete them, and depletion would then make the future population to suffer. And we want the growth should be sustained. So here the word sustained would be used. The word sustainable indicates growth without significant inflationary pressures and significant environmental damage, while the word sustained indicates that the growth should be balanced, and it should be at a more stable rate for the future populations as well. So depletion of non-renewable resources would make the economy worse off, especially for the future population. Again, the fact that economic growth results into environmental pollution and damage is a cause of concern for policymakers in the state, because what happens is that your welfare is suffering like that. What's good for the population if the population is suffering from respiratory diseases? At the same time, the growth is going up. I mean, the real GDP is going up, but at the expense of high levels of, maybe death rate goes up, or higher levels of respiratory problems or breathing problems, because that would again put significant strain on your healthcare systems. You don't even have enough doctors and nurses and hospital beds to cater to that loss, right? Especially if you're a poor country. Also remember that at times when economic growth occurs, so in economic growth, what happens is that your incomes are going up, right? Your national income goes up. If national income goes up, there might be a subsequent increase in your imports. So your imports should go up. And if imports go up drastically, that would have a negative impact on your balance of trade. It might end into a deficit. If you were in a surplus, you might end into a deficit, or your surplus may go down, or maybe your deficit may worsen. Also remember that economic growth at times would result into greater inequality of incomes, and the disparity between the rich and the poor goes up. The disparity between rich and poor goes up. That is, your relative poverty goes up. Relative poverty talks about the inequality of incomes, because so what happens is that your because at times economic growth is just, the rich only benefit from economic growth. The poor are not benefiting from economic growth. So the economic growth should also result into equal distribution of income, because if economic growth is coming only from maybe the economic growth is only coming from areas in Pakistan, such as the big cities in Pakistan. So in that sense, the rural areas or the poor people will not benefit from that economic growth, creating more income inequalities, right? Or maybe the economic growth in Pakistan is only coming from the banking sector. which is already full of probably rich, educated class. But the other sectors are not contributing to that growth, which would again create more income inequalities, right? Also, the benefit needs to be shared equally between the rich and the poor. Again, you understand that. However, so yes, economic growth has advantages, it does have disadvantages, but that doesn't mean that the government should not aim for high economic growth. So in a conclusion, what you will say is that governments should aim for high economic growth. Definitely they should, because economic growth is an important macroeconomic indicator. However, they should aim for sustainable and sustained economic growth. That's the conclusion. They should aim for sustainable and sustained. Now, they should aim for sustain. Don't say they should not aim for economic growth, right? They should not aim for economic growth, or because economic, who on earth would not aim for economic growth? So you should aim for economic growth, but not for unsustainable economic growth. We don't want economic growth that comes with significant environmental damage and significant inflationary pressures. We want economic growth that is more sustained and more stable and more balanced. So the economic growth should be balanced, it should be more sustained, it should be more sustainable, and it should result in a greater equality of incomes in the society. And that's when economic growth would actually make the economy, people in the economy, more better off. That's how you end your answer, and that's how you nail your answer as well. Okay, guys, that's it for this video. I'm going to see you all on the next video. Till then, take care.